Hello and welcome to another episode ITWeb Security Summit 2025, brought to you in association with Snowd. So, right now I'm joined by Noelle van der Waag Cowling, who is a Strategy and Innovation Officer at the Cybersecurity Institute. Noelle, thank you for joining us. I think what we're going to talk about is going to be...
Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, so I know you're talking at Security Summit, and your presentation is going to be around, I guess, the geopolitical kind of space and those kind of international forces, perhaps that kind of level above what some of the other guys are talking around. So you ask, are we in a ransom war? How would you describe the current way or state of play between ransomware groups and national or corporate targets?
Thanks, Adrian. Yes, this whole notion of a ransom war has actually been coined by a Swiss research consortium under somebody called Max Smeets, who's a leading sort of thinker in this area. And I think it's a very neat way of stating what in fact has been going on for some time. I remember in 2020, Biden and Putin actually met in Geneva to discuss ransom attacks on the US in particular, and what needed to be done now to make this stop. So if we look at, are we in a ransom war? I think it's fair to say that ransomware has reached a level that is actually unsustainable for economies if it continues to escalate at the pace that it's escalating at. And it's a really great way to devastate adversary economies, companies, etc. So it is at a level that it's beyond damage, that it's not damaging on a strategic level to states and their economies. Yes.
I suppose it's a kind of silent warfare, really, is you don't, you'll know perhaps that some companies have been breached, but if it's a kind of continual, gradual thing, you're not realizing that it's happening all over the place. Okay. And what evidence suggests that we've gone from that kind of criminal activity into nation-state warfare?
I think the evidence is in, obviously, the advanced persistent threat groups are studied very, very closely by teams of experts. Most of these cyber criminal groups, in fact, they have very transactional relationships with governments, especially in the states in which they reside, in which they actually run the operations from. And they're frequently actually proxy actors on behalf of those states. So what do states win by that plausible deniability? They're 1 or 2 degrees away from what's actually going on, but they're harboring these criminal groups, and these criminal groups can actually undertake services on their behalf as proxy cyber mercenaries, whatever. So sometimes they're acting for themselves, sometimes for a government. So it's all very mixed up. And in that sense, they're almost mercenary-like type of activities, if you want to call it that.
So yeah, I mean, we talked about it moving from a criminal to rise into that kind of strategic warfare. So your presentation covers the privatization, national security risk. So can you unpack what that means in practical terms?
Yeah. So in fact, the term was coined by a former head of GCHQ in the UK. And Karen Martin, I think it was, made the point that we're in an age where we now witness the privatization of national security risk as far as cybersecurity or cyber threats are concerned. So how does that come about? Let's use the example here of a state-owned enterprise, which is the sole supply of something we really need, like the national transport system or energy. Okay, and that entity has got its staff running cybersecurity for it. If it's hit, that entity has to respond, but it's actually a national crisis that unfolds because of that. It can, something like blackout in South Africa could actually result in significant societal instability very, very quickly, because you can see the ramifications: no food, no petrol, no water, all of that sort of thing, right? So you're sitting with a looming national security threat at this point. If it eventualizes, it's going to be disastrous on a state level. But the team in charge of fixing the problem is a little team inside a semi-private entity. And the same could be said for a bank that might go down or something else. So you're actually looking at civilian teams working in commerce or industry or wherever, but they're actually up against often state-backed strategic malign actors. The state doesn't have a handle on actually mitigating that risk Most states don't call these guys in and say, you're a critical industry. What are your plans if you go down or whatever? Everyone assumes everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, but it very often they're short to the resources they need for it, etc. Or you can underestimate the damage or how long it would take to restore critical services. You now have this phenomenon in cybersecurity of national security risk having been privatized because we live in the systems of systems, where our entire society is based on infrastructure that's run within systems of systems. And most of these are in private hands, some telecommunications, whatever it is.
Yeah. I suppose, I mean, we've got some experience of what would happen if the power did go down, typically for a short while. Like, as you say, for a sustained period, if there is that kind of need to get things back online over a week or two.
That would be disastrous.
Yeah.
Absolutely disastrous.
So I think one of the things that I found fascinating from you on my conversations earlier with one of the sponsors of that Security Summit was that he was talking essentially, we've got four major powers which are in the cyber world, which are China, Russia, the US, and Israel. And we're kind of, to some degree, most of the other nations are beholden to them for their cybersecurity services or solutions. When you kind of take those powers out, and perhaps it's the first time I thought of looking at the world in that sense, like how does that make cyber diplomacy for a country like South Africa, where we're kind of going off to the US and bringing golfers into an office to try and make one bit of person happy, but also maybe we're not quite as closely aligned with Russia, but we didn't condemn Russia in the international courts. Like, are we playing quite a strategic, long-term kind of cyber game, or do you think we're winning?
I don't think we think about the strategic cyber game at all, actually, if I'm quite honest with you. So, South Africa is a key member of both UN bodies that are responsible for formulating the norms for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So, on a diplomatic front, we're feeding into that policy stream and we're taking quite an important role. There's certainly a leading role from Africa. But on the ground, things are somewhat different because, as you've pointed out, there's these competing actors. We talk about the bifurcation of the international system, where we see a total schism potentially between the US, NATO, etc., on the one hand, and Russia, China on the other. South Africa maintains it's non-aligned. But sure, our technology stack is very far from being non-aligned. I think we have significant dependency on the US. And I think if you talk to a lot of people about in the private sector about cyber attacks, they will tell you that we're taking a hammering at the hands of Russian actors. Okay. So I think we're actually fitting quite squarely into one of the camps in terms of the technology stack and who, in fact, is causing so much havoc for us in cyberspace. The Transnet hack, I think that group was either in Russia or Belarus, for example. But on the other hand, these are so-called strategic partners of ours within BRICS, but we're not seeing the negotiation with that government to say, look, our economy can't sustain this. The World Economic Forum estimates that economies lose about up to 2% of GDP annually to cyber attacks. Okay. Now, try and compute that over a 5 or 10-year period, what type of economic growth you may have had. So I don't know how accurate that assessment is, but we do know that globally trillions of dollars are now being lost per annum. And so there's significant effect here, but we're not talking to the countries that are actually harboring these groups. And then on the other hand, as you point out, we're very reliant in terms of our technology stack on a country which is not very pleased with us at the moment, and certainly has hardened their foreign policy significantly against South Africa. So I don't think that, there's this whole substream of diplomacy called, it's a horrible word, tech diplomacy or technology diplomacy, and we're not practicing that very well. I don't think we're planning ahead, and I think we're at risk. If somebody decides, okay, they're going to pull companies, I'm old enough to remember sanctions in the 80s, and how many companies were actually pulled out of South Africa, and suddenly you couldn't get those products. We used to get Apple computers coming in via Taiwan, and they were rebranded as Twapples for sanctions busting kind of purposes. But just try to imagine a future where potentially we have sanctions on us and we can't access some of the critical technologies that we run critical systems on every single day.
Yeah.
So we need to start thinking around this because the world is changing very fast, and the tech wars are an extension of a massive global power struggle that's underway.
I'm conscious that there are quite a few Chinese manufacturers, telcos, telecom equipment manufacturers that Certainly, I know one of the telcos is very reliant on. So I guess that kind of makes it all a lot more complicated. And then I guess you throw in the Starlink type LEO services that everyone's clamoring for. What's that going to do to things? Is that going to,
All of that, but just try to imagine a world or South Africa without Microsoft Windows operating systems.
yeah. I've seen in the house some of the other
Ah,
phone operating systems.
So,
Yeah.
so yes, I mean, we obviously do have other products there. It's not a 100% North American technology stack, but I think we have a major dependency on a lot of that type of software and European software, something like SAP, for example. So if you look at an international system which is divided, we're definitely, from a technology point of view, customers of the Western system, if I can put it that way.
Okay.
For the most part, 80%.
So I've spoken to you over the years. I've spoken to various public sector IT guys, and they've often talked about South Africa building its own technology. And I've sometimes thought, well, like, but these things exist. I've never really thought of the international issues around that. Is that something that I think there was talk of South Africa launching its own satellites? Is that something that you think we should be advocating for? Is kind of
Yeah, well, we actually have quite a few satellites of our own up already. I think the idea of building your own technology sounds great, but now let's just try and think about what that means. So let's say we decide we don't want that dependency on Microsoft Windows. We're going to go and build something off a Linux, a South African version. But no, maybe we don't want to do that because it's open source. Maybe we're going to develop our own one completely. Well, that's great. And so I've got to run on every PC or laptop. But what about all the application software that's got to go on top of that? Is SAP going to build a version especially for that, just for South Africa? Okay, and you start extrapolating that and you can really see it's not going to happen. So the reality is all countries are enmeshed in a technological environment in which things have been set out and designed to run in a certain way. And that is how it is. But this is why we need now to start managing, identify potentially systems which we may have to have replicas of that run on other things. I'm not quite sure what the answers are, but it's time we started asking these questions for sure. And of course, when it comes to cloud, it's important that our data centers are localized and energy sources for those data centers. I'm very much in favor of nuclear power stations driving data centers and AI. I think, currently we have the problem, I think, because we're actually a cloud colony for the big cloud providers, that if we lose contact with them, our cloud's designed to shut down. The cloud so that's quite problematic. It's something we don't have any control over.
yeah. So this has all been quite depressing, if I'm honest. Maybe if we could end or kind of bring the conversation to an end on a minute. I asked the questions. I drove you down this road. Is there kind of anything that we can do? Like if you were in charge, if you had free reign across government or in the corridors of power, what would you be recommending to come solve this over the next 5, 10 years?
Well, I'd go for as much localized technology as I could. For example, in terms of physical technology infrastructure, I'd certainly diversify the technology stacks. Try and encourage our local tech industry to develop as much local tech as possible, especially on the application type of layer, to run also on systems which are relatively neutral that nobody really owns properly, like Linux-based systems, etc. So especially for critical infrastructure and whatnot, I'd very much advocate, when we talk about sovereign capabilities, there I see a role for cybersecurity development in terms of hardening our local systems with our own sovereign capabilities on top of those. That's something I'd very much advocate for and push money towards that industry.
Okay. So I think, yeah, the last question I'm going to ask you then is around skills.
Yeah.
Because that's a good, solid plan. That's how we kind of harden ourselves and not cut ourselves off from the world, but make ourselves more resilient.
Yes.
Where are the skills going to come from, given that we're already struggling with skills in South Africa and the brain drain, either in IT or in cyber?
I actually don't see the skills shortage in quite the same way. I think we're missing some critical skills at middle and senior management. I think it's possible to buy those skills back in, especially as we see overseas market shedding jobs. We have a youth demographic which actually favors our workforce going forward against Europe and North America. We have this demographic dividend. We have an experience problem more than a skills problem in South Africa. We haven't adequately aligned business industry and, government industry and academia to actually harness our technology issues and decide how we're going to work to bring these together. So the National System of Innovation, the National Science System, we need to relook at that. We actually have really good higher education institutions in South Africa, and we have great corporates that have proven to be incredibly resilient. I think the kinds of people I've certainly met and worked with in government over the years, I think we underestimate the human capital in the public service. It's a question of aligning and having a plan and bringing these parties together. I think we've got the potential or the capacity to produce the skills we need. We may need to bring in some senior people. China does that all the time. They've got the 1,000 Talents program. We need to think a little bit out the box. We can actually rejig our tech industry and revitalize it and actually become a major tech exporter again. South African ICT industry is very, very strong still. So we're not building off a zero base, not even close to it. We've got what it needs. We're not aligning everything in the way that we need to.
Okay. Well, I think you managed to save that feeling of negativity. If there's a space and if you're kind of inclined that way, I'd love to see you in government. I'd love to see you making this change and going dashing heads.
That's good. Thank you.
Sure. That's been Noelle de Waag Cowling from Cybersecurity Institute, and the industry, I'm sure. Please stay tuned. We'll have more videos up shortly.